probably about the third time now. I think I've done a Zoom tasting, so it's certainly becoming the new the new norm. Still takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's always nice to be able to see people's faces and be able to have a bit of a conversation rather than sit here in the spare bedroom presenting some wines to you. But we'll see. We'll do our best. Actually, I feel a bit sad sitting alone in a spare bedroom drinking wine, but it's a good job I've got some online friends. So a couple of exciting things that we're looking at today. One is obviously it's the release of the new vintage of Tom. This year we're not running with a Syrah, but we have launched a Chardonnay and a Bordeaux blend, and we'll talk a bit more about those as we get to them. So that's, I guess that's the first exciting bit of news. A new Tom launch is always sort of fairly highly anticipated and exciting. The other exciting bit of news is a new range of wines that we've got we've launched. The range has been in cellar door now for about a year, but we're extending that beyond cellar door, and that is a range of wines called Church Road 1. And it's called Church Road 1 because it is they are a single vineyard wines. And so whereas the idea behind Tom is obviously it's the very, very best wine that we can craft. It's probably a little bit more, I mean, it's built around very, very good fruit, but it's a little bit more, when compared to one, it's a little bit more about the winemaker's art as well. So we blend between vineyards to try and create, or very often blend between vineyards to try and create something that is sort of a harmonious whole. And we tend to look for wines that have just got a little bit more, I guess, noise and interest, and perhaps a little bit more winemaking complexity. And I would describe the Tom wines as having a slight sense of kind of luxuriousness, I guess, compared to the ones. Whereas what we're trying to do with one is it's almost the opposite of that. It's kind of peeling back the layers and the complexity and trying to deliver something that we think shows a really, really good, pure, fairly sort of pristine example of what the vineyard will produce. So kind of pared back without all the ego of us winemakers kind of living in the glass as well. It's very much just about the vineyard. So that's kind of where we're at with the one range. I just before we get into tasting the wines, for those that don't know, I'll just do a very quick history of why we've got a wine called Tom. So it's an unusual name for a wine if you don't know the story, but essentially Tom was named after our winery patriarch, a very famous man in the New Zealand wine industry by the name of Tom McDonald. And Tom actually was awarded an OBE for his services to the New Zealand wine industry. He started in the industry, or started at Church Road when he was 14 years old, washing bottles. It was and basically doing all the lackey work. It was a full-time job for him. He left school at that time. And by the age of 19, he'd taken over the running of the business. So the original founder, a man called Bartholomew Steinmetz, had retired and moved back to Luxembourg for 2 years, where he was originally from, before eventually settling back in New Zealand. And Tom actually took over the lease of the winery and ran the business from the age of 19. And he actually had to take out a winemaker's license as required by New Zealand law at that stage under his parents' name, because he wasn't old enough to hold a winemaker's license or indeed to drink. So that was probably an interesting conundrum. But I guess the thing that made Tom really famous was that he, at a time when he entered the New Zealand wine industry, at a time when largely what we were making were cheap wines, a lot of cheap fortified wine, and quality wasn't really on the radar. It was kind of the cheapest form of one of the cheapest forms of alcohol on the market. And as a winemaker who recently retired from our business, who actually started with Tom McDonald, said when he first started in the industry, you didn't tell anybody you were a winemaker because your social standing was about one up from drug dealer. And that was kind of the state of the industry at that time. So not a lot to be proud about. As Tom learned more about wine, he really fell in love with the great wines of France, particularly Bordeaux and Burgundy, which was very much the centre of the winemaking universe back in those days. And he, I guess, like any admirer, I guess he wanted to see if he could emulate his heroes in Bordeaux and Burgundy. And he was one of the very, very early pioneers that really started to look at wine seriously in New Zealand, and is really credited by a lot of people as being one of the driving forces behind that early renaissance of quality winemaking in New Zealand. And it's a very, very important figure in the industry as a result. So I guess the other point there is, what does that mean today? We can sit here and talk about history all we like, but there's always a little bit of a so what factor when it comes to history. It's certainly just because you did amazing things in your past doesn't mean you're still doing amazing things. We like to think we're still very much at the top of the game, and I guess the inspiration for us behind the Tom story is that Tom challenged what the accepted norm was in terms of the level of quality that could be achieved in Hawke's Bay and in New Zealand. And we like to think that we very much use that as a guideline to focus us and make sure that we're always challenging what is being done in the industry, and always looking to go that next step better and produce wines that are that little bit better every year. So we don't tend to, we're not big fashion followers. We don't tend to chase show results. We don't tend to chase, we do well in the shows, but we don't tend to chase the fashions that the industry can sort of swing down certain paths from time to time. We're just very, very, very much focused on what we think we can do to make the wine better, rather than looking over our shoulders to see what other people are doing and chasing those trends. So hopefully that works for us. I think it means that we have a house style that's quite different to a lot of other wineries in Hawke's Bay, and that gives us it gives the wines a real sort of character and a personality that I think is quite unique to us, and hopefully it's a good unique and not a bad unique. Yeah. All right. So that's probably enough of a background. Can I assume, Liz, that everybody has poured the first flight of wines, do you think?
Yeah, I think, could we perhaps have some thumbs up from everyone's poured? Yeah, we're getting lots of thumbs up there. So, yeah, looks like the whole Crawford family have poured. So there you go. Everyone in the Crawford family online tonight, Chris.
Oh, very good. Good. How are you guys? More thumbs up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're all poured, all good.
Yeah. Very good. Okay. So the first wine of the flight is actually the first of the one new range of wines in the one range. So this is a Chardonnay that retails for around about the $70 mark. So it sits sort of in between Grand Reserve and Tom. It's a single vineyard wine off our Tuki Tuki vineyard. Tuki Tuki was a vineyard that was actually planted by Tom McDonald in the 1960s. It's a very cool site. It's about 4 kilometres inland from the coast on the Tuki Tuki River Valley, on some rolling hills that face sort of a gentle west slope, sort of facing the Ruahine Ranges. and with Tomato Peak, just so you look over the river toward Tomato Peak just to the south. It's actually a very heavy clay topsoil, but that clay is very, very shallow, and then you hit a very, very hard clay pan, which is actually a calcareous clay that's a result of limestone outwash from the valley. So there's a limestone influence in the soil that we think brings a kind of minerality to the wines that grow in this valley. So we think it's our favourite sub-region for Chardonnay in Hawke's Bay, and we've got two of our own vineyards in this region, and we've got a grower that we also take some fruit off as well. But certainly the top wines are coming off this Tuki Tuki vineyard. It's quite exposed to the sea breeze. It's much cooler than where we grow our red wines. And it always retains a lovely sort of citrus freshness in the Chardonnays and a nice line of acidity, and also this lovely sort of minerality that we think is sort of a component that comes from that sort of limestone influence in the soil that we don't really see from other sites. So the wine itself, winemaking is pretty straightforward. Again, we're trying to kind of let the vineyard really express itself here. So we're trying not to be too heavy-handed. So it's only got I can't remember exactly what it was, but it's around about a quarter new oak. So it's not a big dollop of new oak. It's 100% hand harvest. It's all whole bunch press. It's taking the very, very first fraction of juice off the press cycle. So we actually press directly to barrel. And so every single barrel of the ferment off one press load is a separate ferment, and it tends to be those barrels that are coming off right at the start that we're picking on for this wine. So where a normal sort of high quality Chardonnay made from free run Chardonnay would be around about 550 litres a tonne, with this and also the Tom that you're going to look at next, we're sitting around more 250 to 300 litres a tonne. So we're pretty much taking half of the free run cup. So it's an incredibly low press yield that we're taking here. And we tend to find that the juice that comes off right at the start of the press cycle is giving us a much finer texture, higher acidity, more minerality, and the wines tend to age very, very well from that press cut as well. There's more solids in the juice at that stage as well, so we're fermenting very cloudy juices, and that just gives a little bit more complexity to the wines. 100% wild fermentation, 100% wild Merlot, so it is literally pick it, press it, put it in a barrel and wait. The juice runs straight off the press tray, straight into the barrels. The barrels go off into the press hall, into the barrel hall, and then we just wait for natural ferments to kick off. And they spend about 11 months in oak, so really is about as close to natural wine as you can get. The difference between that and the Tom, Tom's a vintage newer. It's the 2019, and Tom, while it's based on the Tuki Tuki vineyard, around about a quarter of the fruit in the Tom is from the other side of the river on the other vineyard that we've got in that valley, the Terraces vineyard. And that's a new Chardonnay planting for us. We used to grow mostly Merlot over there, but we've pulled a lot of it out, and we're growing Chardonnay there. The vineyard's just in front of the Tomato winery, if anybody knows Hawke's Bay particularly well. So that'll give you an idea of where it is. And it's just a little bit more sheltered than Tuki Tuki, so it tends to be a wee bit warmer. But it has a lot of similar characteristics. It's still a reasonably cool site. Just tends to go a little bit more stone fruit compared to the citrus in the Tuki Tuki. And that sort of blend just enables us to kind of build something with quite a complete and harmonious sort of palate texture. But winemaking wise, the winemaking is very, very similar.
And Chris, you've also got two very, very different vintages there. Can
Yeah.
you tell us a little bit about the differences between those two vintages?
Yep.
Climatically.
So they're both warm years. I think 18 was actually warmer than 19. It was about 18 was a funny year. It was about 15% above average in terms of heat accumulation. But it was probably a little bit like growing grapes in Fiji. It was very warm and very humid and we had very regular rainfall. We got a nice dry spell around about Chardonnay harvest, but there was more weather coming, so we probably picked a little bit earlier than what we normally would, because we were really worried about the weather that was coming, and the Chardonnay was kind of quite ripe and at the point where it could have tipped over quite quickly if it saw any more wet weather, whereas most of the other varieties would have happily sailed through it and did. And so we picked a little bit earlier than we normally would have, and I think probably in hindsight, in that very warm year, that was a good thing to have done, because and we kind of went with that theory again in 2020, even though we didn't have the weather pressure, just because we really liked the results that we got from the 2018. So it's funny that sometimes your hand is forced, and you learn something. The 18 Chardonnays have probably been our most awarded Chardonnays ever, including the Grand Reserve that was the champion Chardonnay at the International Wine and Spirits competition last year. So they've done really, really well.
Yeah, certainly you've kept the acidity there, but it's a much fatter, sort of, not really fatter, but it's a bigger style than the 19, looking at it tonight. We've just got a question about clones. So is it different in terms of the clones between these two wines, or what do you use?
Yeah, that was Mr. Brunskill, wasn't it? Hello.
Yes, it was.
Hello, Mr. Brunskill. Let me consult my book because I can never remember these things. The Tom is 95 and a bit of Mendoza and no, sorry, it's not. It's 95 and sorry, it's a new clone called 1066. So that was the bit that came off. That was the predominant clone that came off the Terraces vineyard. So it's a new planting and it's a new clone. And 1066 is a very high quality Burgundy clone. It's what I would say, it's not a grower clone. It's like Mendoza Chardonnay on steroids. So if you get Mendoza Chardonnay, you get a lot of hen and chicken. So you get the big normal sized grapes, and then you get a lot of tiny little chickens, the smaller grapes in the bunches. The 1066 is just about all chickens. The bunches are about that big. There's no weight in the crop at all, and pretty much every year we've grown it, we've seen the same thing. But it makes beautiful wines, and I actually do. I think they're very sort of Mendoza-like, and so that's a new clone for us. And yeah, this year in the Tom, we've only got 7% clone 15, which is unusual because that's normally a clone for us that is very dominant in the Tom Chardonnay. But this year we're dominant with clone 95, and that was off our Tuki Tuki vineyard. One Chardonnay. I'll have to go back and consult my notes. We had, I might not have put it in there. Hopeless. Did I put it in there?
While you're looking for that, Chris, just the style of the Tom this year, it seems very mineral, and perhaps more so than previous years. Change in the clonal mix, change in vintage. What do you think's done that?
I think it probably again probably reflects some of the learnings we've had in recent vintages, where we had been forced to pick a little bit earlier, is that we ended up really, really enjoying those wines. And part of, I guess it's part of our the Tom 19 to me is the nicest Chardonnay we've ever made, and part of the reason I am of that opinion is because it probably, to me, it's a very, I'd consider it our most modern Chardonnay, and I guess by that I mean it kind of reflects our current thinking as to what makes good Chardonnay. Just a little bit more restraint, just a little bit more minerality, still really nice power, still really good complexity, but just all a little bit more reined in with a slightly firmer, tighter structure, and hopefully as a result the wines will have even better longevity as well. So yeah, I guess we've done in the past, like a lot of winemakers probably, some comparative tastings with really good white Burgundies that we've enjoyed. And I guess one thing the thing that I've always sort of seen with our Chardonnays versus white Burgundy is there was just this slight sort of almost a slight kind of voluptuous fruit sweetness or richness that was almost over the top, and just wanting to kind of rein that in a little bit and give the wines a little bit more focus and line and length and elegance. So that was, yeah, it's kind of fine tuning basically. That's all. That's what it is.
Yeah, I really like it. I think of the Tom's Chards that I've tried, you're right, it's got the refinement through the middle of it that makes it really appealing. Excellent. Yeah. Thank you. Have we got any more questions on the Chardonnays before we move to the first of the reds? You've got everyone speechless. They're not even chatting via message. Okay. So the fruit for the Tom from Tuki Tuki, was that barrel selection or fruit selected in the vineyard? And then can you give us the pH of the Tom Chardonnay as well?
I'll have to consult my notes again, but yeah, the fruit, that's blocks. Yeah. So essentially, we all grow a number of blocks to potential Tom quality. So we essentially Tom and 1 are grown to the same quality level. So we're a little bit harder on crop thinning and what have you, and we also build a bit of fat into that. So even at Grand Reserve level, a lot of the blocks that end up going into Grand Reserve are still cropped at that lower, that very, very low level that's going into the very top wines. Mm-hmm. And we're obviously selecting blocks that we know that historically produce very, very well. But then, we're picking, we pick a number of blocks knowing that they have the potential to make Tom. And then once the wines have finished ferment and finished aging, we will actually take a composite sample of the whole barrel group from that press load and from that harvest, and we will do a bit of a grading tasting based on that amongst those handful of top blocks that we've picked. And then when we've picked our favourite parcel of fruit, so our favourite their favourite block and favourite press load, then we will drill down into individual barrel selections, because all of those wines have been pressed directly to barrel, so every single barrel is slightly different as a fermentation. Now the Tom is pretty low pH.
We've cleverly found that ourselves in the little booklets we've been provided. Yes. So 3.22 was what we came up with.
3.22, and that's 100% malolactic fermentation. So that's kind of where it's ended up after malolactic fermentation. So you're looking at pretty low pH juice to start with.
Excellent.
Yeah, the one was Clone 15 as well. Sorry.
Yeah, excellent. I just got another comment there. They're incredibly harmonious already as such young wines and will age very, very well. So, yeah, excellent. I'd agree. Yeah, I think they're looking great. Cool. Yeah.
All right. Okay, I've run out of glasses now. I've got two very nice Jancis Robinson one glasses bought from you, Liz, actually. Sitting on my...
You like to hear that.
Unfortunately, I need another two.
Yeah, you will do. You will do. Someone needs to organise that for you.
Right.
So we're now on to glass 3, is that right?
Glass 3, yep. Yeah, unless there was any more questions about the Chardonnay.
No, I think we're pretty good there on the Chardonnay. So we're now on to the Malbec, is that right? You've got the same. Perfect.
Yep, according to my label. Yeah, so the one range, again, a single vineyard range. So far we've released a Chardonnay, a Malbec, a Syrah, a Merlot, and a Cabernet Sauvignon. The Chardonnay is off the Tuki Tuki vineyard. The Malbec, Syrah, and Merlot. The first release, these releases, the current releases, are all off the Gimblet Gravels vineyard. And then the Cabernet Sauvignon is off our Redstone vineyard in the Bridge Park Triangle. Now those vineyards, we're not promising that those vineyards will always stay the same. So in any given year, what we want to do is just take a parcel of something that we believe really expresses very, very well what we love about that vineyard. And we might change that from time to time. So Syrah might go from Bridge Park Triangle to Gimblet Gravels and then back again, for example. So, and then one day in the future, who knows, we might end up with more than one single vineyard Syrah at the same time. Yeah. Instead of selling you one bottle of wine, we'll be able to sell you 3.
I'm sure your marketing team would love it if you extended it into more and more of the same.
Yeah. Yeah. It'd be good fun at dinner parties, though, wouldn't it, to have a look at the different appellations? But anyway. So the first one we've got is Malbec, and the Malbec's probably a little bit left field compared to the rest of the range, which is fairly traditional. But it's a particular block of grapes that we've been getting for a long time now, and it always makes one of the most sort of characterful wines. Even in an early ferment, it's one wine that everybody loves tasting while it's still on skins before it's been drained and pressed. We taste the wines every day that are still on skins, and that's one that everybody looks forward to tasting. In the past, it's always been blended, and we really when winemaking and marketing started talking about this project for a single vineyard wine, it was kind of this was kind of my no discussion, no compromise sort of, we'll happily help with this project, but we're doing a Malbec, and you guys don't have a choice. So the Malbec was it was either one range with Malbec or no one range at all. I was still done the one range, but you got to use what you can. So we managed to get some Malbec out in that particular range, and it's a wine that I think does really, really well in Hawke's Bay. It tends to produce something that's actually not, it's quite interesting trying this next to the Gimblet Gravels Syrah. So they're both off the same vineyard and same vintage. And there's some similarities about it. There's a sort of brambly fruit profile that they have. Both the Syrah and the Malbec have this sort of violet floral character for me. Both of them have a spiciness, and the spice in both wines to me is sort of underpinned by a little bit of clove character. But with the Syrah, the clove tends to go slightly more, it goes from clove then slightly into cooler spices like pepper and cardamom. Whereas for me, the Malbec goes into the slightly warmer spices like anise. So there's kind of a similarity to them that is perhaps vineyard related, which is quite interesting. But I often see the Malbec looking not overtly Syrah-like, but I see similarities between the Syrah and the Malbec that comes off that vineyard.
Just with the Malbec, Chris,
Mm-hmm.
It's not that widely planted in the Bay. So the question is, Why, if you love it, is there not more?
I guess in the past we've used it as a useful blender. It's quite good at bringing a bit of volume and structure to other red wine blends. But I guess I don't know. I mean, it's not a variety that's particularly widely sought after in New Zealand. So yeah, I guess we'll see how this one goes. If it takes off and we can't keep up, we'll plant some more.
Yeah, I think I can probably add to that a little bit as well, as I think we have a bit of a misconception of Malbec in New Zealand as perhaps the cheaper Argentinian Malbecs that was all that was coming in here for a long time. And I know certainly, you know, we have some premium Argentinian Malbec in our portfolio now, and when we first brought them in and tasted them with people, it was like, wow, you know, these can be serious red wines. And I think we forget the fact that Malbec does make some of the world's great wines. Yeah. But we just don't think of Malbec in that context, and I think that's perhaps why it's not more widely used. But it's a fantastic grape, and what you've done there is wonderful with it.
Yeah, and it always, to me, Malbec, I mean, it sort of has a rustic edge, but to me, that's part of its charm. You know, it's not as it might not be, you know, a super noble variety like Cabernet Sauvignon or Pinot Noir or Syrah, but it's delicious. It's got this rustic charm to it, which I really, really like.
Yeah, definitely. There's a comment here that you've done particularly well in terms of the concentration in the wine, given the vintage as well.
Yeah. I mean, those gravel soils certainly help in a year like 2017 it's interesting. In a dry year, we often prefer, you know, I'd say in a dry year, I'd expect a lot more of these single vineyard reds to come off the Bridge Park Triangle, because a lot of our top Syrah, certainly our top Cabernets, come off the Bridge Park Triangle in most years. But you certainly see in a wetter year that forgiving nature of the Gimblet Gravels with less topsoil, that water just drains away. And you do get a little bit more weight and concentration in the wines, even in a wetter year.
Excellent. And do you have any sort of idea on how long you'd keep that for? What would you do in terms of cellaring for that one?
For the Malbecs, well, we made, the only guide I've really got is that we made a few Malbecs in the early to mid noughties. And we've still got those in the cellar, and they've actually aged particularly well. They've aged very gracefully. Like the early 2000s, I'd be drinking sort of now, and the mid ones probably would age for a little longer yet. So yeah.
Okay, and so this is the same vines that you've used in those previous Malbecs?
By the time we got to the mid 2000s, yes. So around about 2000, and I think we did a 6 and a 7, and it was just a little cellar door only release. Yeah, for one reason or another, we stopped doing it. But we just enough to sell a little bit through the cellar door, and to have some in the winemaker's library, basically. I think the winemakers drank more than we sold at the cellar door.
It's called experimenting and research, isn't it?
Exactly. You've got to do these things. Yeah,
you do. You know, cool. So has anyone got any other questions on the Malbec? So I think we're going to move to 4 red wines next, aren't we? So for those who have got 4 glasses, we might give everyone a second to change glasses, if that's okay, Chris.
Yep. Sure.
So anyone who has 4 glasses there, we're going to move on to the next flight of wines. And if you do have multiple glasses, it is a good idea to get the wines out of these little bottles. because we get rid of the air as we're putting them into them. You do find the little samples will close themselves up quite nicely. So they do need a little bit of air to open them up. So if you can pour the next 4, that'd be great. And if someone can give me a thumbs up when you're ready, we can start on the next flight. Oh, a few people finishing off those wines, I think, Chris.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I think we've got a few people ready there. Yeah. Yeah, it's looking like it. So when you're ready, Chris.
Yeah, ready to go?
Yeah, I think we are by the look of it.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right, so wine, so we've got the flight number 2. So the first wine in flight number 2 is the, so this is basically our Bordeaux red flight. And so we've got a Merlot in the one range, and that's a Gimblet Gravels Merlot. And that's from 2016. And then we've got we've only just released this one, so it's the first time we've done a Cabernet Sauvignon in the one range. And so that's wine number 2. So they're probably quite an interesting comparison, and just to talk about those 2 wines together, perhaps. So Gimblet Gravels versus Bridge Par Triangle. Now, Bridge Par Triangle, so Gimblet Gravels, probably everybody knows the Gimblet Gravels quite well. It's a very, very stony, free-draining soil in most parts of the Gravels. It's one of the warmer areas in Hawke's Bay. But the Bridge Par Triangle is kind of an interesting area. It's a bit bigger than Gimblet Gravels. It's about, this particular vineyard's about 3 minutes drive down the road from the Gimblet Gravels, so where the Cabernet is grown. And that 3-minute drive it just makes an absolute world of difference. So it is still an old gravel riverbed. It was a gravel riverbed that was laid down about 10,000 years ago versus the Gimblet Gravels, which was actually still a riverbed about 150 years ago. So it's a much older soil. And what's happened in the last 10,000 years is that we've had a lot of wind-blown loess.
Chris, can I stop you there for 1 second? Sorry, my apologies, folks. It appears we've missed wine 4 of flight 1. And unfortunately, no, it's my fault because I have 7 bottles here, not 8. So I thought we were 3 in the first flight. So my apologies. If we can get you just to jump back to talking about the Syrah, and then we'll go on from there. So my apologies, folks.
Yeah, sorry, I'd actually kind of chatted about Malbec and Syrah in the same sort of breath, and so I thought we were kind of moving on, but I didn't really talk too much about the Syrah, so yes, let's go back to that one.
Sorry, yeah, if we can just do that and then jump forward. Sorry, everyone, and it doesn't help that okay, we've got someone else who's got 7 bottles as well. Okay, sorry, David, we'll find you an 8th bottle tomorrow, and you and I can enjoy that. So,
yeah, I know. Yeah, we should only have 7, shouldn't we? That's right. So it was a 4 and a 3. Is that what we're doing?
That's what I thought. So
yeah. So
yeah, we're only doing 7.
Okay,
yeah.
I've got it. Sorry, I've missed the Syrah in the first flight. My apologies.
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, no, the confusion was probably because I was kind of talking about Malbec and Syrah and the comparisons between the 2 wines of the same vineyard, and I ended up talking a lot more about Malbec than I did about Syrah. Yeah, the Syrah's is off the same vineyard as the Malbec, and it was the old mass selection clone, so basically a derivative of that Alan Limmer clone that he rescued from the Te Kōwhata research station years ago. For those of you that don't know that story, I guess Alan Limmer from Stonecroft Wines is very much the modern father of Syrah in New Zealand. And he was notoriously good at not spending money, as he would admit himself, and any opportunity to save a bit of money, he adopted it. And one of those opportunities came up when they started ripping vines out of the Te Kōwhata research station. Alan actually drove up and loaded up a trailer load of literally vines that had been ripped out of the ground, roots and all, and took them back to Hawke's Bay. And amongst that was this very old clone of Syrah that now makes up the sort of mainstay of a lot of the Syrah that's grown in New Zealand. And it would have probably gone on to a bonfire had it not been for Alan kind of saving it. So I don't think anybody really knows what the parentage of this Syrah clone is, other than it's very old. James Busby did bring Syrah to New Zealand at pretty much the same time he brought Shiraz to Australia, around about the same time. And it was planted in New Zealand and grown in the 1800s. And so whether this Te Kōwhata clone is a derivative of that or not, as far as I'm aware, nobody is really sure. But it'd be safe to say that it's a fairly old clone of Syrah that I think was planted in Te Kōwhata in the 1950s. So it's it's an interesting clone. It's quite different to a lot of the modern French clones that we have in New Zealand as well. And I wouldn't say that it's necessarily better than some of those modern French clones, but it's certainly better than some of them, and it certainly does have... Syrah clones are all quite different, and they certainly have their strengths and weaknesses, and some of those can sort of show up in certain vintage conditions as well. So it's kind of an interesting field. I think that we're still probably learning quite a lot about Syrah clones as an industry, and particularly as more stock comes into the country. Yeah, I don't know, what else do you want to know about Syrah? Have we got any questions on that one?
I think mine would be how you've mastered it so well. It's brilliant.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, the big thing with Syrah is it grows like a weed. It sets massive amounts of crop, and you have to drop about 60% of it on the ground. So you've got to be really, really, really mean with it. And yeah, if you give it too much water, it grows too much. And if you don't give it enough water, it sulks and stops ripening. So it's a real fickle beast. But you have to, you've got to be very, you have to treat it quite mean, but not too mean.
Yeah. And just a question here, you've mentioned 14 was better than 13. How is 19 and 20 looking for Syrah?
Now, that's a very interesting question. And I think, so I mean, I kind of thought that for me, 13 was a Bordeaux red year and 14 was a Syrah year. And I sort of see the same thing with 19 and 20, except the other way around. So 19 for me is more, I mean, they're good wines across all of those varieties in both of those years. They were both very good vintages, much like 13 and 14. But for me, the star in 2020 has been Cabernet Sauvignon and to a lesser extent Merlot. Whereas the Syrahs for me looked much better out of 2019, whereas the Cabernets, looked good, but nowhere near as good as 2020. And we're starting to learn a little bit more about Syrah. And one of the talk that I went to a couple of years ago by a very good scientist here in New Zealand who knows a bit about Syrah. He talked about how Syrah is a pessimistic grape variety. So basically, if Syrah thinks life's a bit tough, it shuts down to conserve water. So it closes all the stomata in its leaf, which is how it respires, to conserve water. And a lot of the ripening reaction, a lot of the ripening sort of pathways in the vine stop. And it can take up to, so if you get a really windy, dry day, it can shut down, and it can take up to 2 weeks to start fully operating again. Whereas Cabernet Sauvignon is what they call an optimistic variety. So if Cabernet Sauvignon thinks it's losing lots of water, it basically will go, oh, well, some water will come from somewhere eventually, and it just sails on and carries on going. So it's kind of it's interesting that what we tend to be seeing is that in the years where we have a little bit more summer rainfall and a wee bit more humidity in the summer, the Syrahs are doing much, much better than in the years where we get the very dry, arid summers with the strong northwest winds and those very drying conditions. So yeah, 14 was very much a warm, sort of humid summer with fairly regular rainfall, and then a nice dry autumn. And 2019 was like that as well. It was a very warm summer, regular rainfall, quite humid, and then a nice dry autumn. And so they seem to be years where Syrah does very, very well. Those years where we get that really, where all the grass turns gold and then turns brown and then blows away, those years Syrah doesn't do quite so well.
Very good. So we got, thank you. Any more questions on the Syrah? Okay, lovely. So we will move on, and sorry again about that confusion, folks. Clearly I needed to follow my own instructions at the beginning and read the bottles. Okay.
All right.
Chris.
So I guess, so we poured, I've poured the first two wines of Flight 2, only because I've only got 2 glasses. And the first thing that struck me about these wines is that we often talk about, you know, Pinot Noir and Syrah as being kind of aromatic red grape varieties. We don't often talk about Merlot and Cabernet being aromatic, but gee, these wines are aromatic, but they're aromatic in a completely different way. There's a character that you know that we're onto Bordeaux varietals now. I often think of sort of like aromatic woods like sandalwood and cedar, and or even the sort of like dried lavender or dried thyme, that sort of character. But man, they're fragrant. They're really, really fragrant wines, but we don't often talk about them being aromatic wines. But quite just an immediate departure from the sort of floral and spice characters that that we were seeing at the other in the other 2 reds. So yeah, the interesting, I'm going to talk about these 2 as a set as well, because they're, I mean, interesting obviously that we've got Merlot here on one hand and Cabernet Sauvignon on the other, but also 2 different vineyards. And so Merlot and the Gimblet Gravels, as I was talking about before, Cabernet Sauvignon off Redstone. And the interesting thing about that area of Redstone, the Redstone vineyard in the Bridgepath Triangle, is the Bridgepath is quite a big area. It's about 2,000 hectares. And the soil that, the southern end of the Bridgepath Triangle, it sticks out past Roy's Hill. Now, Roy's Hill sort of shelters the Bridgepath Triangle from cold air that drains out of the mountains above. It tends to hit Roy's Hill and then go around the hill. And so Redstone Vineyard, almost all of the vineyard is in the lee of Roy's Hill. And so it's protected from that cold air that drains down the valley. And about 20 hectares of that vineyard sticks out at the southern end of Roy's Hill into the southern end of the Bridgepath Triangle. And that 20 hectares of the vineyard ripens about 10 days later than the rest of the vineyard. And I'm talking about blocks that you could walk between in 5 minutes. And that 5-minute walk, just because of the loss of shelter from that hill, adds up to about 10 days ripening difference. So it's an amazing effect. the other thing about the Bridge Par Triangle versus that, our Redstone vineyard versus the Gimblet Gravels, is that on the Redstone vineyard we've just got a little bit more topsoil. There's about a foot of wind-blown loess in there, and a lot of that wind-blown loess is actually volcanic ash from the Central Plateau. And it's a very, very high iron content. So while the soil's still pretty free draining and the site is very, very warm, it's actually warmer than the Gimblet Gravels, this particular vineyard. And that's why we grow most of our Cabernet Sauvignon there, being a late ripening variety. It's also got a very different mineral makeup due to the this volcanic ash component. And typically what we see is that where Gimblet Gravels gives us a sort of dark brambly fruit character and gives us really strong, powerful tannin structure, the wines of the Bridge Par Triangle give us a lot more floral aroma, and they give us a lot more a sense of flesh rather than tannin. So there's more mid-palate sort of richness and a sort of a silkiness to the wines and the silkiness to the tannin structure that we don't get in the Gimblet Gravels. And that's why often with Tom we end up doing a little bit of a blend of the two to get the flesh from the Gravels, the flesh from the Bridge Par and the structure from the Gravels, and try and build something with a real balance. But in these two wines, what you're seeing is purely single vineyard. So it's that, and obviously they're different vintages and different varieties as well, but hopefully you can perhaps see some of the character of the vineyard that's coming through. Well,
yeah, they're very, very good. There's some lovely comments coming through there on them. You know, one around the French thinking terroir is more important than variety, and maybe we're seeing some of that come out in these wines.
Yeah. Yes, I think I'd potentially agree with that to an extent.
You thought about that for a little while.
I did, but it's very true. Like, we certainly do see that there's a very strong stamp that the Gimblet Gravels versus the Redstone vineyard puts on each variety. And I think a lot of probably the character of a Bordeaux blend that we made off Redstone versus the character of a Bordeaux blend we made off the Gimblet Gravels, so much more of that would be down to the site rather than the grape variety that were in it. Like, we could do a Cabernet dominant blend off one and a Merlot dominant blend off the other, but I think you'd see a lot more. I think you'd see a lot more difference because of where it was grown versus what percentage of Cabernet Sauvignon you used, for example.
Yeah. And some comments here on the weight and just the roundness of that Cabernet. And I'd also add into that comment, I think, just the purity of it. It's a lovely core through the centre of it.
Yeah, and again, we've just tried to keep that that oak sort of fairly toned back. So I think that's sitting at around about a third new oak, which is kind of a lot lower than we would normally use in these top end Bordeaux reds. But again, just really wanting to try and express what the vineyard delivers rather than how much money the winemaker had to spend.
How much oak was available.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you've obviously seen these wines for a little while in the cellar door. In terms of cellaring potential for them, what would you say?
I mean, we've got a fairly good track record with Bordeaux Red now, and you know, typically sort of around the 15 to 20 year mark, these wines are starting to look pretty good. I don't see a lot of difference. Between the Merlot and the Cabernet Sauvignons in terms of aging. If anything, probably the Merlots, and it's not what most people would think, but the Merlots probably, if anything, age slightly more gracefully than the Cabernets. Not always, but quite often. And yeah, so around that sort of 15 to 20 year mark seems to be pretty good for me. And I love aged Bordeaux's. I reckon the Syrah, Pinot Noir, they will age. They can age very well, but they're also very approachable in their youth. And to me, to an extent, those wines kind of become an older version of themselves as they age. Bordeaux Reds they become something completely different. They just absolutely form into something incredibly fragrant. The tannins go from being quite sort of, they can be quite tight, quite taut when they're young, and a little bit sort of hard to approach. As they age, they just melt into the wine, and the wines become sort of elegant and supple, and the fragrance that develops in those wines is just absolutely incredible. I think they probably change. To me, good Bordeaux Reds age much more. They change much more profoundly with age, and in a positive way than say varieties like Syrah and Pinot Noir, for my money. So I think they're. I'm kind of learning to. After all, Syrah's very new and trendy, and I love it, but I'm kind of going back to showing these varieties a lot more love these days as well. Now the excitement of doing something new's died down, because we've opened some lovely old wines from Tomata, from us recently in a tasting, and they were, by and large, all of them were absolutely delicious, and just made me realise and remember how good Bordeaux Red can be out of Hawke's Bay, and why you should absolutely put it in your cellar for 15 or 20 years if you can.
Yeah. And with the Church Road One label, in terms of a straight Cabernet, has that been released before, or is this relatively?
This is the very first release of Cabernet. So when we first made the one range, we were looking at wines from 16 and 17. And I just, from those vintages, I wasn't happy that we had a Cabernet that quite made the grade. You remember I said earlier on in 18, we were about 15% above normal heat accumulation over the growing season. So it was a very, very warm year. And Cabernets look really good out of 18. We also struck the weather pretty well for Cabernet in 18, and that we had a lot of mid-season rain that kind of was a little bit of a challenge with Merlot. But by the time that had passed through, we hit 2.5 weeks of really good dry weather, and we just hung the Cabernets out, and they looked really, really good. So
what a great wine to start the Cabernet with, Tom.
Yeah.
So there's a question just come through about dry extract. Do you measure it? What level are you aiming for in the wine?
I constantly get told off by Jeff Kelly for this, but we don't really. About the only time I ever measure. Every now and then we'll check, just to kind of, if we're doing like a competitor tasting or something like that. But the only other time I really check is when Jeff Kelly rings me up and grills me because he wants the dry extract for for a wine. So we don't, as a rule, we don't check it. We just, I don't know, taste it and see what we like.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah.
Do we have any comments or questions on those two wines? I think they're both looking really smart, Chris. We've had some nice comments coming through. Has anyone got any more questions on those? I can't believe how quiet you've got everyone.
Yeah.
Okay. So someone's just made you a new wine. They've blended 1 and 2 for you.
Oh, yeah. How's it looking?
Looking very nice.
That'd be a good thing to do at dinner parties. Like you could just buy the 1 Merlot and the 1 Cabernet and the 1 Malbec. So I'm on a sales pitch here. And then and you can, and then you could get everybody around around the dinner table, and everybody you could have a blending competition at your dinner party. It'd be perfect.
I'm just thinking we could do another tasting of this and send everyone out, and we could all play and try and come up with a blend. We could send you our blend.
Yeah. It's a good idea.
Just a comment through that really shows the Gravels in Bridge Par are not first class, second class. They are just different and becoming more so over time. Really cool to see that. Yeah, I think that's a really good comment. Oh, and we've got people keen on our blending idea. Very good. No, they're looking really smart. And what was the reason to release the one range now? So you've obviously had it cellar door.
Basically, a lot of pressure from our sales team. So we originally, the project was designed to give cellar door something that was kind of exclusively theirs, but it's been very successful through cellar door. And I don't know if you've got a picture, you probably haven't got a bottle there that we can show people, but the pack is lovely.
Yeah, we've cleverly got them in here in the little.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Yes, they're on the booklet.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the poor old New Zealand sales team just couldn't. We just got sick of them complaining basically that they couldn't have it. So to shut them up, they've got some. So it's a wine that we feel has a lot more potential than just where it was being sold, and yeah, just share the love basically.
Cool. I must admit, I first came across some Chris when I was judging at the New Zealand Wine of the Year or the Air New Zealand, whatever we were at that stage. And part of that nagging to say, can we have them, is I got to taste them through judging and that, and was like, hold on a minute, what are these?
Yeah.
Some of the nagging's probably come this way because we've been very keen to sell them. So we're very excited to have them in store.
Yeah, well, it's a pretty good problem to have, isn't it, when people want your wine?
Yeah, sure is. And right, so we're on to, I think, the last one.
Yep. Yeah, so the last one, obviously, probably a little bit the star of the night, the original Tom. So obviously Tom started off, well, not obviously, but Tom started off as a Bordeaux red only. So we only ever made one wine in the Tom range. And the first release of that was in 1995. And that was very much to carry on sort of Tom's vision that he had around producing world-class Cabernet out of Hawke's Bay. By that stage, of course, we'd kind of moved on a little bit, and that Merlot had come into the mix as well, and it was more about producing world-class Bordeaux blends, I guess, rather than Cabernet. It would I think as a region, we can happily say that Hawke's Bay these days does produce world-class Bordeaux blends. We've had the likes of the Gimblet Gravels group taking these wines internationally in blind tastings with very top Bordeauxs. And famously, I'll mention this one because Tom was in it, the San Francisco tasting with Harvey Steinman from Wine Spectator and a bunch of other wine writers and sommeliers, with a bunch of Gimblet Gravels and Bordeaux wines. The top three wines were judged to all be from Hawke's Bay. Number two in the tasting was actually the Tom 2005 Merlot Cabernet. I think number four in the tasting was Mouton Rothschild. So that was kind of the caliber of wines that we were up against. So you can, I think we tend to forget with how successful Pinot Noir and more latterly the attention that Syrah is getting out of Hawke's Bay, just how awesome these Bordeaux blends can be. And I still think we've got a little way to go with those other varieties yet before they'll produce wines, particularly as they age, that will produce these wines that are so enjoyable after 15 or 20 years in the bottle, and will stand aside some of the very, very best examples of the world and hold their own. I think they look really, really good. So I'm having said that, we're talking mostly about Cabernet Sauvignon as the driver. This is our most Merlot dominant Tom ever. So in 2016, we had a lovely component of Merlot that really stood out head and shoulders above the other wines in our final grading tasting. And it was always going to be the wine that we ended up building Tom around. So it's actually 81% Merlot, which I think the most Merlot dominant we've ever been in the past was around about a third Merlot. So yeah, we're getting very much into right bank territory here with this blend. So yeah, 81% Merlot off, and that's Gimblet Gravels. And then the Cabernet component is off the Bridge Park Triangle off the Redstone Vineyard.
Mm. And have you played around with Cabernet Franc at all? Do you have any Franc planted?
Yeah, we used to get a lovely little parcel of Franc off a grower in the Gimblet Gravels, and that vineyard was subsequently sold, and the Cabernet Franc unfortunately ripped out. And at the moment we don't have any Cabernet Franc, but it's something that we'll be in the next couple of years doing a little bit of redevelopment at Redstone, and very, very keen to get some Cabernet Franc in there and get that back into the mix. Yeah.
And just a sidestep for a second, we've got someone with us tonight, Fraser, who has a bottle of 2013 Tom Syrah that you signed. Give it 10 more years in the cellar. What do you think?
Yeah, one thing I'd say about Syrah is that we've been making Syrah since 2006 and or 4 actually, and they do age incredibly gracefully. Like, they hold their fruit, they hold their color really well, they don't brown off, and they look really, really good for a long time. The only thing I would say is that they get to a point where I'm not sure why you would age any longer. So it's not like the Bordeaux Reds where you're waiting for that sort of big tannin to kind of really sit back in the wine, and you sort of hope that happens before while there's still some nice fruit. You know, it's Syrah is already, there's already an approachability to it as a young wine. And it's just kind of trying to hit that sweet spot with a little bit of tannin softening, a little bit of complexity developing, and a little bit more of that sort of secondary fragrance coming through, while you've still got the lovely primary sort of florals and spice and the dark fruits and things like that. So what are we now? 13? It's, yeah, probably, you know, any time from now for the next probably sort of 6 or 7 years, you're going to be probably drinking a wine very much at the height of its power, I would have thought. Yeah, it'll age a lot longer than that, but
yeah. It's that whole adage where, you know, I often say to people when asked, should I sell this and how long for, as I ask them, do they like it now? Because, you know, sometimes I think we can get hung up on the idea of wanting to age wine, but if you're enjoying it right now, why wait?
Yeah, and it's so personal as well. Like, one person will enjoy a wine while it's still, you know, while the fruit's still quite fresh and primary, and so if you enjoy your red wines where the fruit's still quite fresh and primary, and you like the florals and you like the fresh berry fruits and the spice, then give it long enough for the tannin just to soften off a wee bit, and then start to get into it. You don't have to, just because it can age for 25 years doesn't mean it has to. But if you like that secondary sort of earthy, leathery, gaminess that you get from sort of older red wines, and some people absolutely love it, then yeah, you want to be at the, you want to be at that longer end of the window. But I often talk about a plateau rather than a peak with optimum drinking time, particularly for red wine. And where you sit on that plateau very much comes down to personal preference, I think.
Excellent, thank you. And we've got actually lots of questions coming in on the same question here, which is the Merlot for the Tom. Is it from the same single vineyard as that wonderful single vineyard Merlot that we loved earlier?
It is from the same single vineyard. It's a different block though, and this one's actually a block. It's one of the most annoying blocks on the vineyard, but unfortunately it always produces one of the nicest wines. It's an extremely, it's an area of the vineyard where there's quite a lot of unevenness in the soil. And so in this particular block and a couple of other blocks on the vineyard, we'll actually go in the day before we decide to harvest. I go in usually with the help of our viticulturalist as well, if I can rope him in. With lots of cans of spray paint, and we walk down each row and we mark basically, so we'll basically mark the ground. So pick these 5 vines, don't pick these 3, pick the next 12 vines, don't pick these 5. And we'll actually spray paint the ground so that the hand pickers will walk down those rows and only pick the lowest vigor vines in the vineyard. So we get down to basically an individual vine selection for this wine. Is what we're doing.
Okay, excellent. And the next question is, larger than Magnum, do you make them?
Larger than Magnum? No, we don't even do Magnums at the moment. Yeah.
Okay. No big bottles.
No, something that's on the to-do list though. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure about larger than Magnum, but we can add it to the list, I guess.
Yeah. So the question then came around in terms of larger bottles. If it was in larger bottles, would that affect how slowly it would age?
Yeah, that was always the theory, I guess, in the old days, was when you've got a cork that breathes, that if you've got a bigger bottle, the cork still only lets the same amount of air into the bottle. Mm-hmm. And so a cork in a 1.5 litre bottle is going to relatively only let half the amount of air in versus a cork in a 750 ml bottle. So it will age more slowly as a result. But these days, with either screw cap or then that's obviously not quite such an issue, because screw cap really slows down the rate of oxygen ingress to almost nothing anyway, unless you're using screw caps that are particularly designed to have a bit of permeability, which not many people are. And in the case of the Tom, we stick a ruddy great wax seal over the top of it, so it kind of puts paid to any oxygen ingress as well. So it's pretty much quite similar to aging wine under a screw cap anyway. And we've done trials with and without the wax, and the wax certainly makes a big difference to the rate of evolution in the bottle.
Excellent. Okay. And we've got some lovely comments coming through here on the weight and the complexity of the Tom, even for a relatively young wine. And you talked before about you thought that you'd sort of mastered this blend more than you had perhaps some of the others. I think definitely the word complexity there is right, because this is, of all of the wines tonight, they've all been very, very good, but this one's just showing that complexity and skill there from the blending. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's a little bit more indulgent, I think, this wine, when it comes to sort of winemaking, where we want a wine that's got a certain, that feels a little bit luxuriant and has the texture, has the complexity. It has, we want the oak to be balanced, but we still want, you can see it's got some, a good dollop of nice, classy sort of new oak there. It's not pretending to be shy. So yeah.
Yeah, we've had a comment on smell the oak and how good it is. Yeah, yeah, lovely. So do we have more questions or comments or anything else for Chris?
See that one?
What's this one? Bouncing back a bit. Who was it that gave us the talk about Syrah closing down Winster? Oh, so who was it that you were talking to about the Syrah being a pessimist?
Dr. Kraz. So a guy called Mark Krasno.
There you go. Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, it's a great story. I can see why there's some interest in that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Chris. The wines have been absolutely fantastic, and I'm sure we'll get a few more sort of questions and comments through before we just finish up. But just wanted to thank you very much for taking some time to sit in the bedroom all by yourself and present those to us. Much appreciated. And just for everyone that has joined us online tonight, we've had some lovely comments through. Thank you. And some questions on whether we're going to continue doing virtual tastings once we hopefully get out of the current lockdowns and level systems that we're in. Yes, we definitely will. We're really enjoying this format for being able to talk to people all across New Zealand, and I see we've got some of our long-time customers from right down in the deep south joining us tonight, so thank you very much for that. And also it's a really convenient format for a lot of people. So just on that, we have put a number of new tastings up online, and in terms of what's coming up over the next few weeks, we have Love Block with Erica and Kim Crawford. I think we've got the Crawfords with us tonight listening to you, Chris. So we have their wines coming up, so Love Block, and we'll also with that, it's actually at the beginning of New Zealand Organic Wine Week, so we'll be exploring organic winemaking and viticulture as well, so that'll be a fantastic tasting. We have a rosé tasting coming up, which will be New Zealand rosé and also some international. And we're going to drag some of our international friends out of bed so that they can come and talk to us late at night as well. On the 1st of October, we have a gin tasting, and we have, I believe, 8 different gin producers, or distillers, I should say, jumping online to talk about their gin. And for those interested in Burgundy, we have a Domaine Parent tasting coming up, which is a comparison of the wines pommard from 2 different vintages. So all of those tastings are up on our website, and we will send out a follow-up email tomorrow just to give you the details from tonight's tasting, and of course a link to purchase Chris's fantastic wines, and you'll also get the details of those other tastings that are coming up. If you haven't booked tonight via your own email address, do make sure you flick us through your email address so that we can make sure you get that follow-up tomorrow. So we do have a few more questions coming out here, Chris, if I can loop back to you. Oh, and we've got greetings from Blenheim tonight as well. So far we've had Christchurch and Blenheim in terms of the greetings. So the McDonald series Syrah, does that still have Viognier in the blend? And should we stock up on the 19? I think the stocking up I'd always say yes to, but let's hand it over to Chris to answer that one.
Well, yeah. Okay. So in terms of the 19, the 19's just been released, and our cellar door, which has been closed over the winter after the COVID lockdown, is just opening up again, and they've got a bunch of new staff there that they were training the other day. So we had the 17 Grand Reserve open, which was the wine that won the champion Syrah Shiraz at the Six Nations Wine Challenge last year. And then we had the 2019 McDonald series. So just like an insider tip, the 2019 McDonald series is outguns the 2017 Grand Reserve, so get in while it's there. And we've made a decent volume of it as well. So I'll be stocking up my cellar with a lot of that one. So yeah, it looks really, really good. Does it still have Viognier in it? No. So generally, I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and have a look at my notes, but I'm not 100% sure. We might have done Viognier in at one stage. I can't remember. We tend to put Viognier. The Viognier tends to go into the Church Road Classic, actually. So we usually, the Church Road Classic has quite a good chunk of Viognier in it, because it does tend to make the wines just a little bit more sort of fragrant and approachable and supple early on. Yeah, no Viognier in the 2019. There might have been the odd little bit that's crept into some of the previous blends, but I'd have to go back and look at mine. No, I'm terrible at remembering detail.
As long as you remember it at the right time during vintage, we're fine.
Yeah.
We've got some greetings from Palmerston North, so from Palmy tonight as well. And Chris, you're a fan of the Tempranillo? We've got a question there.
Just Church Road.
Yeah.
I have to say yes, really, don't I? Yeah, I think it's really it's a variety that we think works really, really well in Hawke's Bay. It sort of ripens about mid-season, sort of not dissimilar to Merlot, and it's a little bit like Merlot in some ways. I guess it's kind of it's a wine that I think it's like the good ones are about that sort of mid-palate sort of plushness and texture, with a reasonably solid tannin backbone without being really aggressive. So there's a good Merlot for me should have a sense of plushness, and I think it's the same. It's kind of the same with Tempranillo. There's an earthiness and a plushness and a sort of warmth to good Tempranillo, and I think we seem to be able to achieve that quite easily in Hawke's Bay. So yeah, early days, we're still learning about it, but yeah.
Very good, excellent. Well, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you once again to everyone for joining us tonight, and also for the lovely comments. I know the team at Glengarry put a lot of effort into filling all the little bottles and getting them out, so I know they will very much appreciate all your comments tonight on how well that's been put together. So thank you very much, and thank you once again, Chris, for taking us through the wines. They've looked fantastic. And we've got a comment here that, which is quite a good one, I think, coming into the end of it, was great tasting the Redstone Cabernet, real revelation for me. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so yeah, really, really good. So thank you all very much. Yes, and another question, do we want the little bottles back? Yes, we do want the little bottles back. I'm sure the team listening to this will be saying, please no, but yes, we do like to recycle them. So, not free refills, I'm afraid, but if you do drop them into Victoria Park, or if you're in Wellington, drop them into our Thorndon store, they'll get their way back up to Auckland. And if you're elsewhere in the country, we might have to wait until you get a collection of them, and then we'll send you a courier sticker to send them back to us. And I've just got a question on when is the gin tasting. I am pretty sure that it is, I'm just double checking it, I'm pretty sure it's the 1st of October. In fact, I'm certain it's the 1st of October. But we'll send out an email tomorrow which will have all of the details in it.
Yep.
Cool.
Thanks everyone for coming along, and thank you, Liz, and your team for putting it all together. It's a really great concept, and obviously a lot of work that goes into all these little samples and labels and everything else. So thank you.
Yeah, cool. Very good. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Cheers.
Thanks, Chris.
See ya.
Bye.